Dr. Uma Ramachandran is a doctorate in ecology and environmental sciences with 22 years of diverse work experience that include technical assistance and coordination of various projects related to environment and biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, environmental impact assessment, socio-economic studies and poverty reduction. She is engaged with German International Cooperation Climate Change Project at the Department of Environment, Government of Tamil Nadu. She has served as ENVIS Coordinator at Environment Protection Training Research Institute, Senior Scientist at MS Swaminathan Research Foundation, in addition to being faculty for PG course on Preventive Environment Management, University of Hyderabad, and guest faculty at Anna University, Chennai. She is trained in various field-oriented techniques. She has been a resource person in several training programs. She has published many articles in national and international journals, newsletters, edited books, and proceedings.
Dear students, welcome to the UGC lecture series on environmental sciences. We are going to continue with the topic on biodiversity concepts and conservation. So, we are looking at the lecture series number 4, and the contents of this lecture is going to be relationship between diversity and ecosystem function, interconnectedness between the ecosystem services and function, economics of ecosystem values, and integration of ecosystem service based programs with our work. Okay, so the first we take up is the relationship between diversity and the ecosystem function. Now, if you look at this graph, it shows you the richness on the x-axis versus the relative efficiency of the ecosystem services. Here the curve 1 is looking at the theoretical relationship between species richness and the ecosystem function, and the curve 2 is representing the influence of intensive management and inorganic inputs on biodiversity needs. Now, the curve 3 over here, it looks at larger areas. So, what happens is in larger areas more species are needed to sustain the ecosystem services, and this curve 4 represents high disturbance. When there is high disturbance, it increases the need for diversity to sustain ecosystem function. So, this is on the landscape scale. So, this is the relationship that to put in short between the diversity and ecosystem function. This flow chart represents the interconnectedness of the regional landscape micro scale, regional and landscapes, global and regional and global levels. Now, if you look at the ecosystem preservation over here, that actually slows down your global warming. Similarly, if you look at ecosystem preservation on this at this level, it increases the carbon storage, and here when you look at the left hand side, it preserves the current species ranges, abundance and functional importance. So, this is how it is all interconnected, and you find that the arrows are all two-way arrows, and this is to show an example. Suppose if you take a small piece of forest fragment in a tropical agricultural landscape. So, what happens here? What kind of services does this provide? Here to the left you find the landscape human community services, which looks at preventing slow soil erosion, preventing or slowing down the soil erosion, improving water quality, barrier for diseases, etc. And if you look at benefits to the country on the whole, sustainable timber improves water quality, medicinal plants. At the global services level, on the right side you find carbon storage and medicinal plants. At the regional services level you find again prevention and slowing down of soil erosion and so on, and services to individuals. So, here you look at pollination. So, a lot of pollinators for the crops, pest control, economically important fruits, supplies soil microbes, etc. So, these are all the kind of services that one can see, and this actually tabulates all the ecosystem services and the function. For instance, we will just pick up one like pollination and biological control. You find that movement of floral gametes, then trophic dynamic regulations of the populations and so on, and productivity, the portion of gross primary production extractable as food and so on. So, this is the relationship between the service and the function. and you look at economic incentives for ecosystem services. Lester Brown is a well known economist. So, here we are talking about many economic incentives for ecosystem service based conservation, which means there are new jobs. So, therefore, there are new products, and because these products have to be created, you find new industries that are coming up. So, this is the concept here, and to convince people we need to provide monetary values of the ecosystems and their services. So, how do we do this? When you look at the interconnectedness and when you look at it's not understood properly, you find that there are some examples. For instance, quantifiable example services are like pollination, which can be actually quantified. Then pest control also you can make measurements, and water quality is another indicator. And our economy, if you look at, it is largely based on immediate gains. We are not looking at long term gains, we are only looking at lucrative or short term gains, which should not be the case. So, how do we go about it? How do companies invest in future, and how do we get individuals to invest in abstract benefits or the global benefits is what we need to think. And if you look at integrating ecosystem services based programs in our work, you have the carbon shares in terms of this Kyoto Protocol, and it is targeted at countries and big businesses, and there are lots of conservation easements. Okay. Now, what is meant by this easement? A conservation easement is a restriction placed on a piece of property to protect the resources, natural or man-made, associated with the parcel. So, easements are voluntarily sold or donated. There is a system by which it is maintained, and these conservation easements, they range in restricting the development and certain farming practices to logging and other resource extraction activities. Then difficulty in convincing people of their economic value, and long term it is actually difficult to maintain, though ideally it is what is meant for. And where do we use these conservation easements? We can use them to promote ecosystem services at global, country, regional and local scales. Forest easements can be used to ensure carbon storage in the form of planting and reforestation and so on, and easements can be used in place of mitigations by large companies to ensure persistent ecosystem services in particular area, rather than just setting up one piece of land just for this purpose aside. And agricultural easements, these can encourage farmers to preserve the soil. But when you look at the globalization, for instance, globalization of the economy, lot of factors are operating, like population growth, there is an over explosion, and technological changes, international competition. All these are actually compelling us to understand personally and globally the production, distribution and consumption of goods and services. So, we need to examine and analyze economic concepts such as basic needs versus wants, using versus saving money, and policy making versus the decision making. So, if you look at this graph, okay, it looks at population versus the resource use. Actually, if you talk of sustainability, you need to apply the principle of sustainable development, where we look at development which is efficient, which is helping us to develop, but at the same time sustain the resources over a long period of time. So, therefore, if you apply that to this graph, and if you look at the resource use that is happening, like how it is shown in this graph, if it is going to be rapid and very demanding, like how it has been in the past few decades, then it is kind of predicted that minus 90% of the resources will be lost by about 2040. So, when you look at this picture, okay, it shows the human impacts on global biology and material cycles. Now, more than half of the world's coral reefs are at high or medium risk. This is because over exploitation is happening and lot of coastal development. This is posing great threat to these reef ecosystems, and the proportion of human activities also contribute and increase the greenhouse gas emissions. And there is a graph right in the middle which shows the number of years, how much of the species extinctions have happened, and it is really alarming. And when we look at biodiversity and biodiversity hotspots, okay, This is at the global, national and the local level. So, you look at this picture which shows biodiversity at the country level, and on the right you have the map showing selected regions of high biodiversity value, because the value of this biodiversity particularly are very high. And what do you mean by biodiversity hotspot? A biodiversity hotspot is a biogeographic region with a significant reservoir of biodiversity that is threatened with destruction. So, an area is designated as a hotspot when it contains at least 0.5% of plant species as endemic. Now, you look at the look at the hotspots. Now, there are 25 hotspots of biodiversity on a global level, and out of this 2 are actually present in India, and these are represented in the Indo-Burma, that is earlier the eastern Himalayas region, and then the Western Ghats in Sri Lanka. So, Western Ghats is part of India. These hotspots cover less than 2% of the world's land area and are found to have 50% of the terrestrial biodiversity, which is a significant percentage. Now, this shows the list of the different world's hotspot regions country wise. Like you find North and Central America, you have Caribbean, California, Floristic Province, etc. Then for instance, if you look at Africa, you have Madagascar and Indian Ocean Islands, Eastern Arc Mountains and coastal forests and so on. Asia Pacific, you have the Philippines, Sunderland, New Zealand. Now, this looks at the biogeographic classification of India. What are the criteria for determining these biodiversity hotspots? There are 2 main criteria actually. Number 1 is number of endemic species, that is species which are found nowhere else. It is very much particular to that particular region. So, it is specific to a particular region. And number 2 is degree of threat. What is the degree of threat which is measured in terms of habitat loss? Okay, this is measured in terms of habitat loss, and this map of India shows the different biogeographic classifications of India in the different regions, starting from the Trans-Himalayas to the different islands. So, when we look at it separately, in the Trans-Himalayan region, for instance, you have the Ladakh mountains, where the Marco Polo sheep, which is endemic to this region, and you have number 2 the Himalayan region, which is the Monal. It is bird of 9 colors, and in the Indian desert Thar, you find the last surviving wild ass, and this picture shows the semi-arid region, which is in the Gujarat and Punjab plains, Gujarat Rajputana, last surviving Asiatic lions. Western Ghats, you have the Malabar plains, the national animal tiger is represented in this region. Region number 6, you find the Deccan Peninsula, where the Asiatic wild buffalo is specific to this region. Gangetic plain, you have the upper and lower Gangetic plains, here the Gharial, which is presently only in the Ganges. Then you have the coastal region, which is the western east coast, Lakshadweep. Mangroves are an important ecosystem too, so it is represented in these regions. And northeast, you find the Brahmaputra valley and northeast hills. You have the great Indian one-horned rhinoceros, which is largest of all, and the hillock gibbons on the right, there is a picture of that. So, the only ape that is found in India. Now, the 10th region is the Indian islands, the Andaman and Nicobar islands. You have all the coral reef ecosystem, which is represented in this region. And if you look at the status of biodiversity, for instance, India has 2 major realms called the Palearctic and the Indo-Malayan, 3 biomas, namely tropical humid forest, tropical dry deciduous forest and the warm semi-arid deserts. And our country also is 12 centers of origin of cultivated plants. It has about 10 biogeographic regions, which includes whatever we saw now, that starting from the Trans-Himalayan up to the islands and coasts. And India also has 5 World Heritage Sites, 12 biosphere reserves and 6 Ramsar wetland sites. So, amongst the protected areas, India has about 88 national parks, 490 sanctuaries covering an area of about 1.53 lakh square kilometer. And if you look at endemism in our country, about 33% of the country's recorded flora are endemic to the country. So, Northeast, Western Ghats, Northwest Himalayas, the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Of the about 49,219 plant species, 5,150 are actually endemic and distributed among 141 genera under 47 families, corresponding to about 30% of the world's recorded flora. So, this is endemic to India. This 30% of the world's recorded flora are actually endemic, and of these endemic species, 3,500 are found in the Himalayas and adjoining regions, and about 1,600 are found in the Western Ghats alone. Then if you look at the amphibian species, 62% of the known amphibian species are endemic, with the majority occurring in the Western Ghats, which is 50%, with a high degree of endemism. Okay students, now we just go for a short break and we will come back and continue with endemism. Dear students, welcome back to the UGC lecture series. So, we are continuing now with the portion on endemism. When you look at the endemism status in India, we find about 33% of the country's recorded flora are endemic to country, Northeast, Western Ghats, Northwest Himalayas and the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Of about 49,219 plant species, about 5,150 are endemic and are distributed among 141 genera under 47 families, which is corresponding to about 30% of the world's recorded flora. Of these endemic species, we find that 3,500 are in the Himalayas and adjoining regions and 1,600 in the Western Ghats. About 62% of the known amphibian species are endemic, with the majority occurring in the Western Ghats, which is about 50%, with a very high degree of endemism. And next we move on to crop and agro biodiversity. So, this is biodiversity associated with agriculture. So, here we look at the agro biodiversity, which is biodiversity associated with agriculture. India is a center of crop diversity, as I have mentioned earlier in one of the slides, which is a homeland of about 167 cultivated species and 320 wild relatives of crop plants. India's record of agrobiodiversity is also equally impressive. So, it is considered to be the centers of origin of about 30,000 to 50,000 varieties, which includes rice, pigeon pea, mango, turmeric, ginger and so on, and it ranks 7th in terms of contribution to world agriculture. And when we look at mega biodiversity countries of the world, and what is exactly meant by this mega biodiversity countries? These are countries that contain as much as 7 to 8% of the world's species. The 12 mega biodiversity countries that have been identified are India, Brazil, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Mexico, Madagascar, Zaire, Australia, China, Indonesia and Malaysia. So, therefore, India, we should be proud that we are one of the 12 mega biodiversity countries of the world and one of the 4 in Asia. What are the different threats to biodiversity? There are lots of threats which includes population pressure, pollution, over exploitation, habitat loss, alien invasive species, climate change, natural disasters, poverty, policy failures, poor environmental law, unsustainable development projects, lack of control over resources. So, what exactly is species extinction, which is one of the threat? This has been assessed globally. Habitat loss and degradation is the consequence. So, 89% of all the threatened birds, 83% of mammals and 91% of all the threatened plants. So, this is the kind of extinction. And habitat loss, actually this lot of agricultural activities, extraction, that is mining, fishing, logging, harvesting, then development activities like human settlements, industry and all these are contributing to habitat loss. Exploitation, here the hunting, poaching, collecting, unsustainable fisheries and trade, all these are leading to exploitation. And I was just talking to you about one of the threats which is the AIS or the alien invasive species. This is nothing but replacement of native indigenous species by some other exotic species. So, this causes habitat loss and species extinction. So, what does this all lead to? You find that habitat, you find the downward arrow where the habitat loss is leading to extinction through different steps: fragmentation, which is leading to isolated populations, then increasing vulnerable to inbreeding depression, high infant mortality, and then susceptible to environmental stochasticity. So, changes in forest composition and quality on the right hand side. So, what happens here? The resultant habitat type is actually, there is a lot of change that is occurring, and decline in primary food species for the wildlife. So, therefore, there is decline in the species also. So, if you look at zone wise specific threats for all the biodiversity, in a wetland area it could be siltation, eutrophication, encroachment, tourism, etc. In forests it could be deforestation, degradation, extended cultivation, road laying, mining operation, and so on. So, these are examples of some of the threats which are specific to these zones. And similarly, if you look at for instance corals, this is used as raw material in the cement factories, exploitation. Now of course the coral is banned, the usage of coral for these purposes are banned, but illegally it happens in some of these regions. Then it is also been exploited for red coral for jewelry, commercial exploitation of aquarium fishes also from the Indian coral reefs. Then there are some threats associated with mangrove ecosystems, which is agriculture, aquaculture. That is in fact over exploitation of these aquaculture, that is through aquaculture is happening, and fuel wood extraction, diversion of fresh water for irrigation resulting in increased salinity. Then threats to rivers, for instance, it can be heavy metal pollution, persistent biocides, organic wastes, removal of sand from riverbeds. And threats posed to animals is exploitation for their skin, fur, wood, tusk, meat, medicine, oil, trade, and so on. So, more biodiversity means gain and less biodiversity means loss, which we have seen already in the very first slide in the lecture 1 of this biodiversity concepts and conservation. So, to summarize what we have looked at so far, first is about the strong linkages, the aspect between strong linkage between biodiversity and ecosystem function, then strong linkage also between the ecosystem service and the ecosystem function. Then we also the important point is the economic incentives that are underlying all the ecosystem services. And the fourth point is it is very important to integrate all the ecosystem service based programs and conservation easements whenever we carry out any work. And globally, if you look at the different 25 biodiversity hotspots, so globally there are 25 biodiversity hotspots that exist, and 2 of them are in India. And India has also been selected as one of the mega biodiverse countries with a significant percentage of endemism. And there are a lot of threats that are existing to biodiversity which requires suitable protection and conservation measures. If you remember this particular slides on the different threats to biodiversity, we saw a lot of threats ranging from over exploitation, overpopulation, and a lot of things like even the invasive alien species which really threaten most of the ecosystems because of they do not allow the native species to come up. So, they kind of invade, and then there is a significant loss in the native species. So, looking at these, and I have also mentioned about these lot of threats which are specific to certain regions which we need to keep in mind, such as the mangroves, or it can be the specific to sea or ocean, and specific to forest, agriculture, and so on. So, this is very important because only if we understand the nature of threat and the extent to which the resources are being exploited, we will come to a kind of proper conservation measure to conserve this biodiversity. So, therefore, it is very important that we understand all the underlying causes that are contributing to the significant biodiversity loss, and we always should remember that more biodiversity means gain and less biodiversity is actually loss. So, we now look at the list of questions that are associated with this chapter. So, explain relationship between biodiversity and ecosystem function, then explain relationship between ecosystem service and function. Then what are the economic incentives attached to ecosystem services, what are conservation easements and what is their role. Then define the term endemism and biodiversity hotspot, and what are the major criteria of this biodiversity hotspot. Then what is meant by mega biodiversity country and what are its salient features. And the next and final question is what are the major threats to biodiversity and threats that are associated with specific zones such as the wetlands and mangroves. So, in the next lecture we will have a look at the Millennium Ecosystem initiatives and assessments, and we look at why we are going to really conserve the biodiversity. Thank you.